Hi, I'm Max Keiser. This is the Keiser Report. You know what I'm fascinated by is that consumer protection labels that you find on cigarettes or you find on household cleaning substances don't apply to financial products, even though they should, because many of them are hazardous to your health because they're poorly constructed and they're full of toxins. But anyway, we'll get more into that as time goes on. Stacy?
Max, we are going to talk to the audience out there about the ghouls of financialization. Now, everybody in the US media, and especially from the resistance sort of left, were mocking Trump for saying the crazy thing of, maybe we can inject disinfectant into Americans in order to help them recover from coronavirus or COVID-19. So while they were laughing at them, though, the very same day they were laughing at Trump for saying this, they announced this. Biden didn't even wait until the official nomination to bring in the ghouls. Yes, that's Larry Summers advising Biden campaign on economic recovery. Just a reminder that Summers in 1991, while running the World Bank, issued a memo saying that we should dump our toxic waste from the West, the developed nations, onto the least developed nations, to those who can't fight back because they don't have the wealth or the sophistication to appreciate how toxic waste can ruin their environment. They don't understand beauty like somebody like Larry Summers. He also was instrumental in passing the Commodities Futures Modernization Act, which legalized gambling, turned derivatives into a giant pile of risk that could be dumped onto pension funds because allegedly they're sophisticated enough to understand the toxic risk they are taking for their pension fund members. And then he also got rid of Glass Steagall by helping to pass the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act, which removed the separation between investment and commercial banks. So this is that guy that Biden is now bringing in to help with the economic recovery, like any ghoul would want to help with any recovery. They feast on corpses.
So this was an attempt to keep a wall between the most reckless of speculators on Wall Street and the banks that hold people's money. Was these laws that were in place for a long, long time. And then he was able to get rid of those laws and get rid of those barriers, which opened the floodgates of the predatory and reckless speculators into the banking system. They made many, many off the charts, risky bets that lost, which then resulted in huge bailouts and the destruction of the economy. The Glass Steagall had been in place after the crash of '29, put another barrier between the worst elements in finance, the most reckless speculators, and your money, your savings. He decided, no, we want to be able to use people's savings as our collateral to engage in wild speculation, like long-term capital management would never have existed, and the destruction of long-term capital management, the destruction of Enron's evisceration and disappearance, WorldCom disappearing in a heartbeat. That's all thanks to Larry Summers getting rid of all barriers between the worst predatory financiers and your money. And of course, the response by other people like Mnuchin, Treasury Secretary, who's kind of a disciple of Larry Summers, is to simply, again, pay no attention to the rule of law and to just take out an enormous pitchfork and shovel money into their friends' pockets as fast as possible.
You mentioned Enron, and of course, Larry Summers was friends with those sort of guys, Ken Lay, all these big brains. Remember, they believe they're so smart and so much better than everybody else. Ken Lay was the previous guy to Jeffrey Epstein, who was also a friend of Larry Summers, who under federal custody mysteriously died, and all their case disappeared and their wealth remained intact. So when he was under Bill Clinton as then Deputy Secretary of the Treasury, Summers testified before the U.S. Congress on July 30th, 1998 about the Commodities Futures Modernization Act. And remember, this was basically legalizing total gambling and derivatives and the explosion of the derivatives that we had. The parties to these kinds of contracts are largely sophisticated financial institutions, he argued, that would appear to be eminently capable of protecting themselves from fraud and counterparty insolvencies.
Let's talk about what the Commodities Futures Modernization Act enabled. It enabled sophisticated Wall Street financiers to package all of their risk and to dump it into pension accounts. So pension accounts are either underfunded or they get raided in various hostile raids. But the toxic dump, where these ghouls come out of this toxic dump. Think of the teacher's pension account or the fireman's pension account or the union's public workers' pension accounts as a swamp of risk, that where these ghouls like Larry Summer come out like Godzilla or the Thing or the Blob, and every couple of years they're pulled out of the swamp of risk and they're given a new job. Here Joe Biden wants to give them a new job, and so this blob, Larry Summers, just extruding risk in kind of like this slime, is now back in place to create more financial terrorism, and it's quite sad.
Remember also what we saw with the primaries for 2020 was that Joe Biden has no support whatsoever from the millennials, anybody 40 and under. So here is that risk, because remember, Larry Summers, how he operated as when he was at the World Bank in 1991, he did that famous memo on December 12th, 1991, where he said that we need to ship more of this toxic waste that is costing the developed countries like Europe and America, it's costing us so much money to have to get rid of this waste. Why not just send it to the least developed nations like Latin America and Africa? So he's already got this in his mindset of how to get rid of the risk onto somebody who can't fight it, right? Who doesn't have the power or the agency to fight it. Well, 3 catastrophes in 20 years are hammering millennial finances. So these 3 catastrophes followed on Bill Clinton, Larry Summers, Robert Rubin, the ghoulish financialization that they impose. So you have the dot-com crash, you have the 2008 crash, and now you have this 2020 crash and massive bailouts. The ones now are happening when millennials are 40. The one before that was when they were 30. And the one before that, the dot-com crash, was just when they were turning 19 and 20 and graduating from university.
Well, let me explain how, very simply, the pension fund, the passive money, ends up losing money and kind of inheriting or being subjected to massive risk, toxic risk, thanks to Larry Summers and thanks to the laws that he had changed or the new laws that he brought in. So, I mean, I worked on Wall Street for many years, and I have observed this many times. Very simply, a trader at a Wall Street bank makes a highly speculative trade, but they do not give an account number for that trade. It's done in street name. They wait a day or 2 or 3, and if the trade is profitable, then they supply the account number, which happens to be one of their friends. If, in fact, it's a massive loss, then they supply the account number, and it's a pension fund. And the records look like the account number was given upon execution, but that's not what happened. And it's called parking a trade. It's illegal, but thanks to Larry Summers, the way to track whether that's going on or not, the mechanics of regulatory oversight are made opaque to the point where they're rendered impotent. So that means that, and this is how JP Morgan, remember last year, I believe, they reported 90 or 100 straight days of straight profitable trades without a down day. That was a clear example of what's called a look-back trade, to use the professional parlance, the vernacular of a Wall Street financial terrorist. They simply take the winning trades and give the losing trades to typically a pension fund who's run by a very low-level person that has no agency, as you point out. So many of these pension funds, they can't understand why their performance is so horrible, but they don't have the ability to actually challenge these weapons of mass financial destruction, as Warren Buffett called them.
So just so you understand why our system is so toxic, why these ghouls of financialization rule the world, why we have this messed up system with trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars of bailouts, trillions of dollars for bailouts for those that are friends and so smart, like Larry Summers, right? The smart guys, because Commodity Futures Modernization Act, because of Glass Steagall, risk and reward was able to be separated, obviously with options too, in the Black-Scholes options formula. So they were able to separate risk and reward. And this thinking that Larry Summers himself, which he says was sarcastic, but you know it's the truth, is that the risk should be dumped onto those who are not as smart as us, not as good as us. The reward should just be kept for those like us, because we are so smart. Without us, the rest of the economy can't survive. They need us. That's why you have situations like this bailout for small businesses, mom and pop. It went, JP Morgan gave it all to their super wealthiest clients, and none went to their small business clients.
Right. You mentioned Jeffrey Epstein earlier. I mean, if you were to create a morality index or a morality scale, certainly he would be at the most reprehensible. His moral character is
ghoulish.
Ghoulish and reprehensible. So on that scale, you would have to put very, very close. You'd have to put a Larry Summers right next to Jeffrey Epstein on the morality scale, and a Jamie Dimon and a Lloyd Blankfein as well. And that's really, they occupy that position on the reprehensible, ghoulish morality scale that for some reason our political class keeps digging out of the ground, digging out of the swamp, and giving some authority and political position to continue their financial, their jihad against America.
Well, it's just pure ghoulishness. Their ghouls prey on the dead, prey on the helpless, prey on those who can't fight back, prey on those who are not given agency. These agencies of ours are put at the disposal of these sort of Larry Summers who architected this system, who behind the scenes, everybody, these are the architects, the Larry Summers, the Jeffrey Epsteins, the Ken Lays, who are behind the scenes architecting the system. And finally, I want to say, again, here the smartest guys in the room get bailed out. All you idiots and imbeciles get all the toxic waste. You will pay for their bailouts. Oil bailout Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin said he's considering creating a government lending program for U.S. oil companies. U.S. oil companies who were so stupid that they kept losing money for 10 years and kept pouring money into it.
Why stop with bailing out the oil industry that is dysfunctional? Why not also bail out the buggy whip industry and the ladies' petticoat industry and the snake oil industry and Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus? Why not just bail out everything in the present and go back 300 years? You get a fee, Steve. You get a fee. All right, we're taking a break. When we come back, much more coming your way. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. It is with great pleasure that I introduce my guest, the big egghead, top thinker, research director, and all-around nice guy from GoldMoney, Alasdair Macleod. And full disclosure, I'm an investor in GoldMoney. Alasdair, welcome back.
What an introduction.
Yes, you should put that on your Twitter handle. All righty, well, let's get into it. Time is short, and your intelligence is vast. So let us begin. Bank of America is calling for $3,000 gold by October of 2021. They blamed the central banks and said, quote, the Fed can't print gold.
I think it was a statement of the obvious, but if they really understood what they were talking about, then they would understand that infinite printing means an infinite price of gold, or more correctly, no price for gold measured in fiat.
That's one thing that people, I don't think, quite understand. They always say, well, gold is quite volatile, but in fact, the gold price doesn't really move at all. It's maintained the same, more or less, purchasing power for thousands of years. It's the fiat money surrounding gold that's volatile. What are your thoughts on that?
I think what you say is absolutely right. The mistake people make is they think gold is an investment or something to speculate with. They don't understand that it's money. If they understood it was money, then their attitude towards it will be completely different.
Now, Donald Trump got in trouble recently because apparently he said during a press conference that people might want to take disinfectant as part of the COVID-19 infection. And this started a run on disinfectants, and people started to imbibe them. Not sure about why exactly. But anyway, looking at gold, is it kind of actually a disinfectant against a toxic monetary system?
It's certainly not proving to work in that respect because they're printing regardless. I mean, the central banks are agreeing amongst themselves, and we're talking about at G7 level, that all of them are going to print ad infinitum. It doesn't matter what happens, print, print, print. And of course, they've also got to counteract contracting bank credit because the bankers are terrified of what's going on. They're being asked by the central banks to just pass money through to clients who are going bust. And this is a situation they've never seen before. They are becoming risk averse. So not only have the central banks to print enough money to get through to save everybody, save the world, but they've also got to print the extra to, if you like, counteract the contraction of bank credit. I mean, it really is absolutely crazy.
You're talking about all the money printing going on at the central bank. The Federal Reserve Bank of America now has over $6 trillion in assets that have no resale value. They're effectively worthless, that they bought by printing up a fresh $6 trillion. So the first part of the question is, can they go to Japan-like levels of 100% of GDP? And that would mean $20 to $22 trillion of printing, number one. And number two, your recent post is titled, Anatomy of a Fiat Currency Collapse. Will fiat money survive the COVID-19 pandemic of money printing? What does a collapse look like? So the first part is, can they get to 22 trillion? And the second part is, walk us through your recent essay, Alasdair.
22 trillion, easy peasy. In fact, they're going to have to print a lot more than that just to make up for the payment failures in all the supply chains. The supply chains total not just GDP, but all the intermediate steps towards a final product. And you're really looking at a figure which is more in tune with gross output, which is 38 trillion. And that's just in the United States. And it doesn't take account of the supply chains coming from outside the United States. So, I mean, this is really infinity, just in that one thing. And the other thing, which is desperately important, and this will lead through to answering your second question, is that you can sum up the whole of monetary policy as being the imperative to keep financial assets from falling in value, and particularly the lead financial assets, which of course are government bonds. Now, this is something that John Law did 300 years ago, or he tried to do, and he failed. Now, he only had one asset to keep up, and that was his Mississippi venture. He printed livre, French livre, his own livre, in order to sustain the price, and eventually it failed. This will fail because it's not just one security, it is every financial security in the world. The task is massive, and the attempt to sustain value in these financial assets will destroy the currencies.
I love the John Law comparison, and anyone interested in this topic should really explore John Law. And more recently, similar, not quite the same, would be what happened in Iceland when the Icelandic banks were printing essentially money to buy back their own shares ad infinitum, and then they all in concert collapsed. But, you know, we were talking about negative interest rates recently and how that is an historical anomaly. No one had ever thought about doing this before. It seemed crazy, and yet it did exist and is an ongoing policy initiative. Well, you know, there's something new, even more ridiculous, some might argue, and that would be a negative price on oil. So oil prices went negative, which is just as toxic, I would think, as negative interest rates. Are the two related, Alasdair?
No, not really. I mean, as I understand it, and I'm not an expert on the oil market, the real price of oil, you have to look out, if you like, along the futures curve to 6-12 months. And that gives you an idea as to exactly what the price is. The fluctuation is all at the front end, and it's because of delivery problems. We had this situation on NYMEX where people had bought the oil, if you like, oil contracts, not realizing that the seller could actually dump the oil on them. And that's actually what happened. And they got nowhere to put it. I mean, it was like I don't know, sort of a farce. I mean, a complete farce. And the consequences were really quite dramatic, got the headlines and all the rest of it, but it doesn't mean anything beyond that. I mean, certainly I would say that with the way the global economy is going, which is rapidly downhill, then demand for oil is likely to fall substantially as well. So they're going to continue to have this problem. I don't see a meaningful recovery in oil prices for some time. And looking out along the futures curve, I would have thought that prices there would tend to drift lower anyway. So we're not out of the woods as far as oil is concerned, but I think what happened last week was a pure freak. I mean, it was a freak of markets.
Oh, right. Well, I'm going to push back a little bit on that, because what strikes me is that for the exchanges and the regulators to allow for a negative oil price print to exist, they're setting a precedent which says two things. Number one, no laws of matter pertain to this physical commodity, and no rules on the books are also being applied. No one's enforcing any rules on these exchanges. One particular ETF, which has the ticker symbol of USO, flagrantly violating multiple securities laws for suitability and position limits. And the idea being that we're financiers and the laws don't apply to us. And this does spill over to the bond market with negative interest rates, and it does spill over to the gold market with naked short selling, market suppression, market manipulation. So in total, this does affect gold in a big way, but I would imagine that there is a point where the fraud in oil, interest rates, and gold catches up to the market, and we see a genuine print based on genuine demand. If suddenly the price of gold reflected the genuine demand, absent of all this financial fraud by exchanges and regulators, what is the fraud-adjusted actual physical price for an ounce of gold today, Alasdair?
I mean, I think what you're describing is frauds within a far wider fraud. The whole of the banking system is a fraud. The idea that a bank could just issue credit out of thin air is fraudulent. And this is something that goes back to Roman law. Justinian accepted that the idea that banks can actually create money was fraud. I mean, it is a fraud on the people. So, yeah, there's fraud and fraud and fraud. And certainly, as far as the gold market is concerned, I mean, it's been the whole intention has been to suppress the price of gold ever since 1971 by expanding the amount of paper supply to absorb any demand. And by and large, that's worked. And it's worked actually until very recently. And we're now in the situation where that is no longer working. So I think the whole of the fraud is beginning to unravel. We're seeing the early stages of it. And I think this is very important. And from, I think, all our points of view, the sooner that aspect of things ends, the better. Now, having said that, it's going to be extremely uncomfortable for people who are not prepared for it.
Let me get your opinion on something. A statement I made recently about the 25 or 30 million folks in America that are unemployed or soon to be unemployed who have no money. They have 2 weeks worth of cash and then they are entirely bankrupt. One of the points I made, curious what you think about this, is that in America, since we follow Keynesian economics, that hates the idea of savings, where people like Paul Krugman at the New York Times refer to a, quote, savings glut, as if they're vilifying savings, as if savings are evil. Isn't that part of the problem? And if you were to contrast Keynesianism with something like the Austrian school, which actually celebrates savings, wouldn't that be a conversation worth having? Why don't we save per an Austrian model to build the capital in the economy, and therefore we can enjoy capitalism? Because under Keynesianism, you can't have capitalism because, after all, without capital, you can't have capitalism.
I agree with you entirely. And the wish expressed by Keynes in his general theory was that the saver would be euthanized and that the state would provide the capital necessary for investment. He also seemed to think that the entrepreneur was happy to do his work and the profits were a secondary consideration. I mean, this is the mad world we've actually ended up in. And we've spoken about this before. I think 80% of Americans 80% of Brits, I mean, I'm talking about salary earners, are living paycheck to paycheck. So you're absolutely right. They've got no savings, no cushion, nothing whatsoever. And it's really backfired on the state with this coronavirus because the state has decided to look after us. The state has taken over our basic functions, our families and everything else, and our necessity to provide for ourselves. And now we have this virus, and now they're running our lives even more deeply. And the cost, of course, is going to be completely destabilizing for every economy in the world.
One final question, since you're over there in London, we're talking about supply chains around the world being challenged. I know there's issues there in the UK. What's happening on the ground?
The strains, I think, mainly are sort of psychological. Small businesses are in deep trouble because, again, like individuals, they don't have the cushion of savings in order to see through a crisis like this. The whole thing, I mean, it's all emerging that this is a lot worse than anybody thought it would be. And the idea that, you know, we return back to work after it's done and we just continue as normal, forget it. It's going to be a lot more serious than that.
Alasdair Macleod, thanks for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you for having me, Max.
All right, well, that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser and Stacy Herbert. I'd like to thank our guest, Alasdair Macleod of GoldMoney. If you want to catch us on Twitter, it's Keiser Report. Until next time, bye, y'all.